Many of you know Thomas. He's an incredible Mac malware research and an OBTS OG as well. I think he's talked at every single objective by the sea. So round of applause to Thomas Reed.
All right, can everybody hear? Yeah, sounds like it. So, hey everybody. So today we're going to be talking about the evolution of the Mac threat landscape. I've been around for a while now. I've been using Mac since 1984, and I've seen a lot of things. I think my first piece of Mac malware I ever saw was in 1992 at a campus computer lab. So I've seen a lot of interesting things over the years. So I thought we'd start out this morning with something fairly non-technical and talk about some of the old malware that has been around and sort of compare and contrast with what we're seeing today. So, old behaviors compared to new ones. Just a little bit about me to start off with. As mentioned, my name's Thomas Reed. I work for Malwarebytes. I'm director of core technology there. And a big part of my job there is really knowing the Mac threat landscape and the Mac, customers. So let's kick it off here with the very first widespread virus. So this is not the first virus. There were other viruses before this, but the really first really widespread one, contrary to popular belief, actually affected Apple devices. So it was the Elk cloner virus in 1982, and it affected the Apple II computer. It spread through floppy disks, and on I believe it was the 100th run of the virus, it would display this little poem on the screen. So really it was kind of just a prank. It was just for fun, nothing malicious about it. Although apparently it did crash some computers, but this is kind of the way that viruses started, is they were just kind of proof of concepts and pranks to start off with. These days we don't really see a lot of viruses on the Mac anymore, or even on Windows for that matter. Viruses are much less common these days than they used to be. But we have seen a few things that had virus-like behavior. So back in 2020, we saw ThiefQuest, which was some malware that, among other things that it did, it actually infected binaries that were found in the user's home folder. Now, of course, in the user's home folder, you don't need any special permissions there. So it could freely infect the binaries, and what it did is it prepended the malicious code onto those binaries so that the malicious code would run, and then it could run the legit code, make it look like nothing was wrong. One of the biggest examples of binaries that it infected this way were a number of Google helper processes that at the time were stored in the user's application support folder. I did notice that these are no longer there on my latest system. So apparently Google learned not to put binaries there. Now the good news here was that Google actually detected this. So if you were running an infected system and your Google helper processes had gotten corrupted, gotten infected, and then you open Chrome, Chrome was smart enough that it would actually notice the files had been modified and it would delete them and replace them with new copies. But who knows what other processes might have been infected and not had that benefit of that kind of intelligence. So we also we think of polymorphic and encrypted malware as being something relatively recent and sophisticated, but this actually was, seen back in 1988 with 7dust on the Mac. This was another virus. Viruses were really the big, the main source of malware back in that day. And this was, there were a lot of different versions of 7dust, lots of, encryption and whatnot to keep it from being detected. And this was getting a little bit more malicious. So some versions of the malware actually would delete files. It claimed that it could speed up your graphics operations, but it really didn't do any of that and did some malicious things. And it was a little more than just a prank. So these days, and we've seen some of this in earlier talks yesterday, there are a lot of obfuscation and encryption techniques out there these days. So a lot of what we see on the Mac are obfuscated shell scripts. So up here on the screen is an example of a launch agent plist. And you can see there that what it's doing is it's taking a base 64 encoded string and it's passing it to base 64 to decode it, and then piping that to bash. And this is a very typical trick, which it almost defeats the purpose, because if you just look for stuff like this, where you're seeing something getting piped to base 64 and then to bash or to SH or ZSH, that's an immediate sign that you're dealing with something malicious. So why even bother obfuscating when you've got these obvious indicators here? UPX is also a very common method for encrypting malware on Mac OS. That keeps reverse engineers from being able to easily look at it, and you've got to jump through some hoops to decrypt it. We also see lots of highly obfuscated binary code, and I forget who, but somebody showed some examples of that yesterday. There are all kinds of different examples. Lots of malware uses custom code, and they'll do things like basically just bit shift strings, or they'll have strings where they've got numbers for each ASCII character that are separated by different characters, or all kinds of different techniques they use to hide the strings that they're using. Somebody also talked about compiled AppleScript. So there's really not been an easy way to decompile and analyze compiled AppleScripts. There are some ways these days, but they're not perfect. They're definitely not up to the level where you can be at with your typical binary code with opening it up with IDA or Hopper or something like that. And then, of course, the bane of any reverse engineer, or apps built with Go or Rust or Electron, and they just makes you want to tear your hair out when you see one of these, because they're a pain in the butt to figure out what they're doing. So back in '95, we saw the first word macro virus. It was called Concept, and that's really what it was. It was just a proof of concept. It was not malicious, but this was the first cross-platform malware. So this could infect Macs and Windows machines, which was, really new at the time. Blew everybody's minds. Unfortunately, this malware actually, brought in the era of word macro viruses being really common and widespread, which brought about the end of John Norstad's excellent disinfectant app. For those of you who are old enough to remember that, that was just the best app, best security app ever at the time, and really just crushed me to see that go away. And this was the reason, because it just couldn't cope with the word macro viruses. So these days, word macro malware really isn't it used to be more common than it is now. I still see it being, fairly popular with red teams. I think maybe some red teamers might, agree or disagree, but it seems like it's popular with red teams. Where we do see it in the wild, it tends to be more targeted, because you've got to use some kind of a sandbox escape, which means you've got to have, a certain version of Word or Mac OS in order to target that, and you've got to know your victim is running a vulnerable version of the software. You can see here actually. This example here is some malware that actually stole directly from a proof of concept made by Adam Chester. and you can see it actually uses the xpnsec name there, so it's kind of a giveaway that it stole his code. And this used a sandbox escape that actually no longer works. I tested it just to see before the talk. I was just curious if it still worked, and it doesn't work anymore. But interestingly, word macros do still exist on Mac. You can still enable them, which I don't know why Microsoft thinks that's a good idea, but I think they should just die. There we go. Looks like we skipped one. Something's wonky here. What is going on here? Let me just start that over. All right, there we go. So the first backdoor was in 2004 with Renipo. It was also called Opener, although Renipo is kind of a better name because Opener is a real common word. And this was a Trojan, unlike a lot of the stuff that had come before was more virusy. And it was really the first Mac backdoor. It exfiltrated a lot of data. Another thing that it did is it changed a lot of system settings to make them less secure. And that's also something we see today with certain things. Today, it seems like almost every piece of malware for Mac has a backdoor of some kind. And there are so many different kinds of backdoors out there. I mean, it's anything from some kind of open source tool like Eggshell or Empire or something like that, to just your basic reverse shell, to something like a Cobalt Strike beacon. We've actually seen Mac malware that has used Cobalt Strike beacons in its operations. But one of the things that we often see with Mac malware is just custom backdoor code, just written in Objective-C or Swift, compiled Mako binaries. And that's hard to detect because, depending on the obfuscation and exactly what they're doing, it might be really tough to spot that. Unless you're, doing something like with EDR where you're looking at behaviors and not the compiled code. And here you can see an example of some custom backdoor code. This was decompiled in Hopper. And you can basically see that it's just taking a string that it receives and it's passing it to bash, essentially. So just running a script with bash. So that's a fairly common technique that a lot of malware uses. So in 2007, we saw RSplug, which was kind of the first real financially based malware. So this was malware that actually, it was also called DNS changer because it would change your DNS settings and it would set your DNS to a malicious server. And it did this for the purpose of phishing so that it could actually change the server to for certain sites to a malicious site to try and get your credentials and get basically your money. And this was eventually shut down by the FBI. It's kind of an interesting story. The FBI shut down, they caught the people responsible, they shut it all down. But because so many people had been infected with RSplug, this was really widespread. The FBI couldn't just shut down the DNS server. If they did, there would have been hundreds of thousands of people whose internet would suddenly stop working on their computers. And they wouldn't have understood why. Folks like us, we might think, okay, let me go check the DNS settings. Your average user, they're going to be like, why is my computer not connecting to the internet? And they'd have no idea. So what the FBI actually did is they ran that malicious DNS server. Although they removed the malicious entries, they still ran that server for years afterwards until they finally decided, okay, we're seeing less traffic on the DNS server now, and they deemed it was safe to shut it down. So obviously these days, everybody knows, lots of malware is financially motivated. There are lots of things involving cryptocurrency especially, so crypto miners and stealers, lots of things that pretend to be wallets or trading apps that really are there to steal your cryptocurrency. We also see things that steal information for the purpose of selling it, so things like credentials or, that sort of thing. That's all very valuable to these, malware creators. So these have been a little bit less common this year. I don't think that I've seen a new crypto miner all year, this is the first year I haven't seen one of those. Maybe because cryptocurrency is kind of not doing so great. But we did see one new piece of malware this year that was more financially motivated, which was Trader. This was thought to be North Korean. I always kind of, I'm always a little leery of attribution, so I will say it's thought to be North Korean. And it sort of was a combination of spyware plus a stealer that was aimed at stealing your cryptocurrency. And North Korea seems to have a particular interest in that, in stealing cryptocurrency. I don't know how that's working out for them these days, but... So then back in 2008, we saw the first PUP. Now, these days, we are awash in PUPs, or potentially unwanted programs. They're everywhere. But at the time, they really didn't exist until 2008 with MaxSweeper. And this was kind of an interesting program. It was one of these junk cleaning tools that we see so much of today. It would use some kind of sneaky and underhanded ways of getting onto your computer, and then once there, tell you, oh, look at all these problems. Oh my gosh, your caches, you've got to clean them. And of course, if you wanted to clean them, you couldn't, because you'd have to purchase the software first. So, it was kind of, it opened the door there to that entire industry that we see on the Mac and on Windows these days. So today, as I said, PUPs are just everywhere. We see all kinds of these junk cleaning apps that, just throw up their hands and say, oh my gosh, look at all this horrible stuff that's going on your system, They call out things like caches and log files and that sort of thing as major problems. And we also see some scam AV apps out there as well. And these are generally programs that have licensed a free AV engine, or maybe not even licensed, or just using it. And they market themselves as a legit AV app, but they use some kind of shady techniques for getting installed and for pushing you real hard towards a purchase. And a lot of these things come in, especially the junk AV apps, they come in through these sites that you can get to through malvertising or a variety of different means that will throw up these big "you're infected" messages. And of course, you click through and you download whatever it tells you to get. Usually it says you're infected with TapSnake. That's like the big thing that they say, which is very funny because TapSnake is not only Android malware, but it's Android malware that's kind of dead at this point. But still, it's a big threat to your Mac, right? And so you download through these sites and you've got your PUP. And unfortunately, some of these AV apps now have system extensions, which makes them really difficult to remove. Basically, those system extensions are protected by Mac OS. So, there's nothing that you can do other than, remove the app through a very specific method. So if your antivirus software removes it, system extension's there forever, basically. We also see a lot of scam apps in the App Store. So there's been a big problem with that in recent years. A lot of these apps that have the subscription scams, like they trick you into, purchasing a subscription that's going to charge you $20 weekly or something like that. And what a lot of these apps do, so there's an example here on the screen, this My Metronome app. Basically what it did is when you opened it up, it would show this window. There was no way to close it. The only way to get rid of the window was to click the purchase button. You couldn't quit the app, you couldn't close the window. So if you didn't know that force quit existed, like most users, then you're kind of stuck. And the way that they get away with this is they actually will do things like they've got a flag that they can set in the app that tells it don't show this particular UI while it's in review. And then as soon as the app is through review and accepted by Apple, then they flip the flag and suddenly the app starts showing this malicious behavior. And then in 2010, we saw our first adware, and this was Opinion Spy, aka Premier Opinion is the name. That's the name of the company behind it. At the time, and this was such an innocent time, they called this spyware, like this is spying on people, because it was monitoring network traffic. And yeah, I mean, technically that's kind of spyware, but in modern times, we know, there's a lot worse you can do with spyware than that. So these days, we would consider this to be adware, because it's really just essentially a tracker. Tracked all your network traffic and then monetized that data. And they're still around. They're still doing this today, just in different ways. And this adware was first found in a whole bunch of screensavers from 7art. So if you went and downloaded one of these screensavers, then you'd have something on your system tracking all your network operations, all of your websites you're visiting. So adware today is everywhere. This is one of the top detections, between adware and PUPs. That makes up almost all of the detections that we see at Malwarebytes. Malware is just a little fraction of that. And ironically, adware is often far more sophisticated than most of the malware that's out there. Now, because of some of the changes Apple has made in recent years regarding code signing and notarization requirements, a lot of this stuff is no longer signed. Some still is, and then it's a whack-a-mole game for Apple. But a lot of times they just don't bother anymore. And so what you'll see is something like this, where they'll pop open a window in a DMG, and they'll give you some basic instructions, control-click and choose open, and that'll bypass and let it run even though it's not signed. Now, of course, Apple can still block this with XProtect if they've seen the adware before, but that doesn't always happen. And as we mentioned earlier, there was some malware that in the good old days that caused a lot of changes to the system and created a lot of security holes. Adware today does the same thing. It will do things like make changes to your sudoers file. We've seen things where every user is allowed to use sudo without a password because adware made that change. It'll install proxy servers, so it's basically man-in-the-middling all of your network traffic. And even if you remove the adware, a lot of times you might not be getting that, that proxy removed. So lots and lots of things that adware does that affects the security of your system as a whole. And even if you remove the malware, your system's still insecure. And it's very, very sneaky. Lots of analysis evasion. It can tell if you're running it in a VM. It can tell if you've got a hopper on your system, something like that. And lots of really sneaky and creative ways of getting the adware installed. So we saw one piece of adware not too long ago that would actually, when you installed it, it would make a copy of Safari in a temporary location. And then it would change a JavaScript file inside of Safari to automatically accept a particular system extension. Then it would pop open that version of Safari while the screen is obscured by other things, and then close it again and then delete it. Now at that point, you open the legit copy of Safari and their system extension is installed, no user input needed. So, the usual thing you see asking you to accept the system extension or the browser extension didn't happen. And so, there have been a number of very creative solutions from the Adware folks to this requirement that the user has to click something to accept the browser extension. And that's basically it. That's a little kind of a summary of how things have evolved over the years. And interestingly, a lot of the techniques that we see today actually got their start as early as the early 80s. So very interesting stuff out there. Any questions? Yeah.
Did Adware revoke the certificate of the system extension?
Unfortunately, no. So when it comes to PUPs, Apple is in kind of a little bit of a hard place. Unless you can prove that they're doing something wrong, Apple, from my interpretation, Apple feels like they can't be the one to say, no, you're not allowed to use certain apps like MacKeeper. So unless you can prove actual wrongdoing, which is difficult with a lot of these PUPs, then Apple's not going to take any action, unfortunately. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So I can't speak for other vendors, but yeah, at Malwarebytes, one of our big focuses is on the PUPs. We have a really strong stance against PUPs, and we have lawyers that are willing to stand behind us on that. And so, yeah, Apple's hands are kind of tied, and I understand why. If you're Apple, you're a huge company, you've got this monolithic platform that could almost be accused of being a monopoly, and then they start telling you, no, you can't use that app because we think it's bad. Not because it's doing anything outright malicious, we just think it's bad. That wouldn't be a good look for Apple. Even though we would all applaud it if they blocked some of these things, it wouldn't be a good look for them. So that's where the third-party vendors really come in, is we can take action on that when Apple can't. Any other questions? Oh, yep. No, I don't think that was actually animated, but that would have been diabolical. Yeah, that would have put the nail right in the coffin there. Yeah.
What do you think the most concerning trend is in these PUPs or other similar?
Yeah, I think with PUPs and Adware, one of the most concerning things about them is that they are very focused on finding that line where they don't, where people can't detect them. Not that they actually can't, but where they feel like they shouldn't, legally speaking. And they try and find that line and ride that line really, really close. And that's where some of the problems lie, not from a practical, detection standpoint, but from a legal standpoint. It's something that a lot of people really just don't want to deal with. And I'm kind of lucky because, I have had legal threats before over stuff like this. I actually had an Adware company before I was working at Malwarebytes threaten to sue me if I didn't take down a whole bunch of blog posts. And that scared the crap out of me. But I'm very fortunate that now I've got folks that will stand behind me and support me in that sort of thing. But still, it's a problem. It's a legal problem. So, anybody else? Yeah. It's pretty large. I don't know exactly how many files or how big on disk, but I have samples going all the way back to the very early days. I don't have samples of every piece of malware that has ever existed for Mac, but I'm pretty close. So, yeah. Yeah, so most of the most prevalent malware that we see these days, which I'm saying malware, but really it's PUPs and Adware. The biggest source of that these days is from malvertising. So you're on some legitimate site, and there's a malicious ad that's been injected into the ad feed for that site. And that malicious ad ends up redirecting you to one of these scam pages. And then from there, you download either some kind of a PUP or some kind of adware. And the user is tricked into downloading these for one reason or other, either because your system's infected or because, look, you have to, there's this content here that you can't see because you need this plugin. It's kind of ironic. Flash Player is very dead at this point, and yet that they still use that as a lure. You got to install Flash Player to see the content. Yeah. I haven't seen that. No, that's something that I probably wouldn't have much visibility into. So somebody else might have seen that, but I haven't seen that personally. All right, cool. Thanks, everyone.